Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, weed, skunk, cannabis, call it what you want, it is the most commonly used illegal drug in Britain, even though being caught with it could land you in prison. The Liberal Democrats' new leader, Vince Cable, says he continues to support the legalisation of the drug. His comments come as a series of politicians from across the political spectrum say it is time for laws relating to the drug to be looked at. Newsbeat's politics editor Jim Connolly is with me. Jim, it is something that is talked about so much, and yet nothing changes. So you've been looking at how it works in other countries. Tell us what you've been looking at.
We've looked at how it works in two very extreme countries, which we'll come on to in a minute, but we've also looked at the political reality here in the UK. There's a growing campaign across the world seeing lots of countries moving towards legalisation or decriminalisation. So we've gone to the new Liberal Democrat leader and asked him specifically, are you going to stick with your policy that you put out at the last election, which was to legalise the drug? Insiders in the party, everyone working within the Liberal Democrats says to us, look, this wasn't a popular policy on the doorstep when we were out campaigning, but the reality is we stick by this because we think it's a better way of regulating the market. The political reality, though, is the government have no intention whatsoever of changing the law on cannabis. They say it remains a Class B drug because of the harm it does to society and users.
So you've looked at how it works elsewhere and whether it could be a template. What is the evidence of what's happening in other countries versus the effectiveness? Well,
what you've got in other countries, you've got countries across... let's look at North America for a start. North America, you've got 8 states legalising the drug. You've got more than half of states decriminalising for medical use. And what you've got there is a movement towards a more liberalised approach in a Western country. Next year, you're going to have Canada going in a similar direction, and they're going to legalise across the whole country. You've had Uruguay do the same. You've got decriminalisation movements happening across Europe. And here in the UK, we've also seen a rise of so-called cannabis social clubs. A few years ago, 6 years ago, there were none in this country, and now there are over 100. They're based on a model, a Spanish model, where users get together, and by getting together, they feel safer from prosecution. They're also campaigning. They're dealing within each other, dealing to each other, so it's kind of a regulated market in their area. And we've been out with Rob from Brighton Cannabis Club.
I mean, it's pretty obvious. You represent Brighton Cannabis Club. It's blazed all over your T-shirt.
Yeah.
How popular is the club?
So far we have over 400 club members. We've been around for about 3-4 years now. We have over 40,000 Instagram followers and 6,000 Facebook likes. And we basically keep growing. And we've had one of our outdoor events, Green Pride, which has grown year on year. So our first year we only had 100 people turn up to it. Our second year 1,000. Our third year 1,500 in about 8 different stalls. And this year we hit over 3,000 people attending and about 25 different stalls setting up for the day, and with basically limited police interruption.
You've also been looking at what is actually on the streets and the strength of what's out there. Skunk, I've said about the different terms that are used. I mean, it's actually mainly skunk that's on our streets,
yeah,
isn't it?
Skunk's quite a controversial term. If you speak to people who back cannabis, who want to see cannabis legalised, it's a really controversial term because actually what it refers to is specific strains of cannabis. What we use the term skunk, the media particularly, the tabloids especially, is this sort of killer, deadly skunk. What they're actually referring to there is high-potency cannabis. And what you've got to look at is what's in cannabis. Cannabis has got 2 main substances that affect the user when they take it. THC, that's the thing that makes people, well, frankly, high, but it's also the thing that linked to mental health problems when it's in very high quantities in the drug. The other thing that there is in cannabis is this thing called CBD, which is actually acts as a bit of an antipsychotic, and it's kind of like the yin to the yang of THC, and it can balance it out, or at least that's the theory that people are looking into. And it's this high-potency cannabis that's, as you say, flooded the streets. 80 to 90% of cannabis bought by dealers, bought amongst dealers on the street, is this high-potency so-called skunk. And as you say, it's linked to mental health problems in people with susceptibility, or at least that's the claims. We've been out to meet a guy called Lord Munson. His son tragically killed himself. He had mental health problems after smoking a lot of this high-potency cannabis. And he says, frankly, it's the skunk that's the problem, and he wants to see it banned.
Lots of people listening to this will find it strange that a drug that you say killed your son, you're now campaigning to legalise.
I think that skunk it's been labelled as cannabis, but it's not really. It's a Frankenstein variant.
Well, that's Lord Munson, who, as you say, lost his son. We will talk now to David Rains, who's a spokesman for the National Drug Prevention Alliance. He is opposed to the decriminalisation. And also joining us from Malaga in Spain is Ian Hamilton, who's a lecturer in mental health at York University and has done research into the mental health risks of using cannabis. Thank you both very much for joining us. Ian Hamilton, let's pick up then on that final point that we were talking there about skunk and the potency of what is on the streets. Are people using cannabis aware that up to 90% of what is being sold on the streets is such high potency? And what are the links to mental health issues?
Well, I think the problem is for many people they won't be aware of the potency of the cannabis they're using until they actually are exposed to it, and that's a real problem. And I agree that regulation would in some ways help to resolve that, because in the same way we do with alcohol and tobacco, there would be a clear idea of the quality and the strength of the product that people were using.
So
nonetheless,
when you say regulation, that would be part of legalisation?
Yes, that's right. And, you know, there's many forms that can take. It's not a kind of straightforward on-off switch with regulation. You know, there are different systems and different ways that can be done. It doesn't have to be a complete free-for-all. You know, there's different options that we could look at.
What do you think about the prospects of legalisation, David Rains?
It's not going to happen in the UK. It's absolutely clear it's not going to happen. About 19 months ago, we had a parliamentary discussion, a debate. Only about 14 MPs turned up, and of them, at least 4, to my knowledge, were against it. A complete lack of interest after a public campaign. The history
I mean, can minds be closed when you look at what's going on in other countries? And specifically, Jim's report looked at the model in Portugal, the model in Sweden. The model in Sweden is a sort of punitive, absolute, sort of strongly policed ban, whereas in Portugal it's about decriminalising. And we saw in Jim's report a little bit earlier someone who in Portugal who was caught at a festival with a small amount of cannabis was taken through a sort of court-style process and was given a psychiatric appointment for half an hour. You look then at the number of drugs-related deaths in Portugal compared to Sweden, and there's a huge difference. A million people in Portugal dying as a result of taking drugs versus nearly 80 in Sweden.
Yes.
So why doesn't that get sort of? Why are you so sure that politicians will dismiss that and stick with the status quo here?
Well, you've mixed up various things. Not very many people die from taking cannabis, although a few do, and that's underreported. Portugal, the UK is probably a sort of halfway house between Portugal and Sweden. I've been to Portugal 3 times and discussed their drugs laws with their parliamentarians. Portugal is sort of decriminalised for possession up to 10 days' supply, but in the UK. The argument that people go to prison for taking cannabis, personal use of cannabis, it's nonsense. In fact, most people don't get prosecuted. So we're much nearer to Portugal than your programme is giving the impression. And there's an awful lot of nonsense talked about skunk. I don't use the term skunk. I use the term high THC cannabis. And the bit about that you said about CBD and THC is correct. But we have to look at where high-strength cannabis came from. It originally came in from the States because they had poor herbal cannabis. It was developed in the Netherlands into what's something called Nederweed, which took over the market there and took over the market here. Now, it didn't take it over the market because pushers pushed it. It took over the market because of consumer demand. And so any legalisation of low-strength cannabis would create a larger market. And we have these laws because they're there to contain drugs use. And actually, we're quite successful. If you look at tobacco, for instance, tobacco use is down from 48% of the population in 1948 to about 16% of the population now. And we've done that through a combination of laws and social pressure. And cannabis is about 6 to 7% of the population use cannabis, and most people, in fact, grow out of it. Now, you started off with the Lib Dem policy. The Lib Dem policy is absolutely balmy. And does Vince Cable, who's a wise old man of my age, does he really believe in it? I don't think he does. I think he's been trapped by his nutters in the fringe of his party.
Well, I mean, but why do you think it's... What do you think are the issues around it? The sort of... The discrepancy between what the Liberal Democrats say on mental health and what they're talking about with drugs?
Well, there's a big problem, isn't there? I mean, Norman Lamb and Nick Clegg have both spoken about mental health services for young people. Now, cannabis causes mental health problems and aggravates them in young people who have them because their brains aren't mature until they're in their early 20s. And
OK, so I want to get the thoughts of Ian on that then, because when people talk about legalising cannabis use, it's not for young people, is it? I mean, what is the evidence for damage in terms of mental health for young people? Ian, I'm not sure. Can you hear us still?
Yes. Sorry, it was breaking up a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, just sort of picking up on that point about the Liberal Democrats talking about legalising cannabis, but also the focus within the party on mental health, and the point of making that sort of... Is it contradictory?
Well, no, I don't think it is. As I was saying earlier, I think regulation offers the opportunity to actually protect particularly young people who, for a very small number, some of them will be sensitive to the effects of particularly high-potency cannabis. So it offers us a public health opportunity.
But as things stand now, with messages going out about legalisation, with the fact that there is primarily high-potency cannabis on the streets, does it send a message to young people that actually it is OK to smoke it, and actually for the dangers to young people to be overlooked?
Well, I think part of the problem is we don't have enough information in the UK about a number of things to do with cannabis, including young people's views. I mean, we have very little in the way of information about how potent cannabis is. You know, we have one or two... No, it is, David. We have
that's
some
not
studies.
Right. No, I can't allow that to go. I can't allow that to go.
Most of them are based on proxy measures. You know, things like Home Office seizures, and the narrative is built up that we have these strains of cannabis, and we may well do.
All right, quickly. Sorry, we're almost out of time. Let me very quickly. You've got like 3 seconds just to respond, David. You wanted to respond to that.
The claim from Ian is absolute nonsense. We know what seizures contain, and we've known what seizures contain since 1973, when I started seizing cannabis at Heathrow Airport. I used to go to the laboratory of the government chemist. We've tested it by gas chromatography for years and years and years. I mean, Ian is just part of that school of people who wants to legalise.
We are right out of time. Thank you both very much for a lively debate. Thank you.